I came home after closing the biggest deal of my career, a $250,000 check in my hand. When I walked into the bedroom, a naked man stared at me and said, "What the hell, man? What are you doing here?" My fiancée stepped out of the shower and said, "Sorry, I lost my temper." I showed her the check and said, "It's okay. I'm starting a new life without you." That's when she started demanding. The deal closed later than anyone expected. Not because it was fragile, but because every signature had to be checked twice, and every clause rewritten after the other side tried to slip in conditions that would have turned a win into a liability 6 months later. I had been living inside spreadsheets and conference rooms for weeks, sleeping in short stretches, eating whatever showed up between meetings, and telling myself the pressure was temporary. When the final confirmation came through, it landed with the weight of something physical. $250,000. A number that stopped being abstract the moment the check was placed in my hand. I remember how clean it looked. Too clean for the amount of stress that produced it. The paper was thick, the ink sharp, my name spelled correctly for once. I folded it carefully and slid it into the inner pocket of my jacket, not because I was afraid of losing it, but because it felt like something that should stay close. That money meant the wedding deposits were no longer a debate. It meant the conversations about timing, about moving, about whether we could afford to wait another year, were over. I pictured the look on Vanessa's face when I told her we were finally ahead instead of catching up. The drive home felt unreal. Traffic moved, lights changed, people crossed the street with grocery bags and headphones, and none of them knew that the longest stretch of my professional life had just ended. I rehearsed how I would tell her without sounding like I was bragging or apologizing. The apartment lights were on when I pulled into the lot, which surprised me. She usually kept them low at night. I told myself it meant she was awake, maybe waiting. I unlocked the door quietly out of habit. The living room smelled different. Not dirty, not wrong, just unfamiliar. A hint of cologne that wasn't mine mixed with the steam from the bathroom down the hall. I set my keys down and took off my jacket, the check still warm against my chest. The bedroom door was ajar. The sound I heard was movement, not voices. I stepped forward without thinking much of it, already forming a question about dinner plans in my head. The question never made it out. A man I had never seen before stood near the bed. He was naked, completely unguarded, as if the idea of being interrupted had never crossed his mind. He stared at me with the kind of confusion that comes from believing you are in control of a situation and then discovering you are not. He spoke first, his tone sharp, territorial, almost offended, as if I had broken into his space. For a moment, the room felt tilted. I noticed details I had no use for. The way his shoes were pushed under the dresser. The way the sheets were pulled tight on one side of the bed and loose on the other. The way my own reflection looked in the mirror behind him, suit rumpled, tie loosened, eyes too alert for the hour. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back either. I stood where I was, letting the reality assemble itself. The bathroom door opened behind him. Steam rolled out first, then Vanessa. She had a towel wrapped around her hair and another around her body, her skin still flushed from heat. She did not freeze. She did not gasp. She looked at me the way someone looks at an unexpected inconvenience, a schedule change they had not planned for. Her expression settled somewhere between irritation and fatigue. She said she had lost her temper. The words landed flat, stripped of any weight they might have carried in a different context. There was no apology attached to them, no attempt to soften what was happening. The man glanced back at her, then at me again, trying to understand his role in a scene he clearly thought belonged to him. I felt something strange then. Not anger, not disbelief. A kind of clarity that made everything else feel distant. I reached into my jacket slowly and took out the check. I held it in front of me, not as a threat or a plea, but as a fact. The paper caught the light from the bedside lamp. Vanessa's eyes tracked it instantly. Her posture changed. The irritation drained out of her face and was replaced by something sharper. I told her it was okay. Not because it was, but because I was done negotiating with reality. I said I was starting a new life without her. I said it calmly, without emphasis, the way you state a decision after the argument has already ended. The man shifted his weight, suddenly aware that he was surplus to the conversation. That should have been the end of it. In any reasonable version of events, that sentence would have closed the door on everything that came before it. Instead, it opened something else. Vanessa did not ask me to leave. She did not ask how I could be so cold. She did not ask what she could do to fix it. She asked about the check. She asked where it came from, whether it was guaranteed, whether it was already cleared. Her tone was practical, almost managerial, as if the bedroom had transformed into a meeting room and I was late to my own presentation. The man started to speak, then stopped. He looked at Vanessa, waiting for guidance, and she waved him off without even looking at him. The gesture was small, dismissive. He grabbed the nearest clothing and began to dress, his earlier confidence collapsing into something defensive. I watched him move around my room, touching my things, and felt nothing at all. Vanessa stepped closer to me, careful not to cross a line she had not yet identified. She talked about timing, about how stress had pushed her into a corner, about how people made mistakes when they felt unheard. She talked quickly, building a structure of explanations that all pointed in the same direction. None of them required her to stop. I listened without interrupting. The check stayed in my hand, not because I was afraid she would take it, but because it anchored me to the present. She asked if the money covered just the deal or if there were bonuses attached. She asked if it was enough to move forward with the wedding without loans. She asked whether I had already told anyone else. The realization settled in quietly. She was not reacting to the end of our relationship. She was reacting to the possibility of losing leverage she had assumed was permanent. The affair had not been a rupture. It had been a hedge. The man was a contingency plan she no longer needed the moment the check appeared. I told her the money was mine. I told her it had nothing to do with her decisions. I told her I was leaving that night. She stepped back then, finally registering that control was slipping. Her voice changed again, tightening around the edges. She reminded me of shared plans, shared expenses, shared time. She framed them as investments. The man finished dressing and stood awkwardly near the door. He looked at me once more, this time without hostility, as if trying to decide whether to apologize or escape. Vanessa did not acknowledge him. He left without saying anything, closing the door behind him with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. The room was suddenly very quiet. Steam continued to drift from the bathroom, curling into the ceiling. Vanessa crossed her arms, steadying herself, and began outlining what she believed she was owed. Not emotionally, logistically. She spoke as if the next step was negotiation, not separation. That was when I understood that the night was not going to end with raised voices or dramatic exits. It was going to end with demands. And whatever came next would be more deliberate than anything that had happened so far. I put the check back into my jacket. I told her we would talk later, with other people present. I told her not to touch my things. She watched me gather a bag, her mind already moving ahead, calculating angles I had not yet named. As I walked out of the apartment, I felt the weight of the check again, heavier now, not because of its value, but because of what it had revealed. The deal had closed. Something else had opened. And it was clear that Vanessa was not finished trying to collect. I did not go far that night. I drove without direction until the city thinned out and the streets stopped asking questions. I parked near a closed grocery store, sat in the car, and let the adrenaline drain until my hands stopped shaking. Not from fear, from the delayed impact of everything lining up too cleanly. When you replay a moment enough times, patterns appear that were invisible the first time through. Vanessa did not call. That should have told me something, but I already knew. Silence was not regret. Silence was strategy. By morning, my phone was lit up with messages that did not ask where I was or whether I was safe. They asked when I was coming back, when we could talk, whether I planned to deposit the check immediately. I ignored them, not out of spite, but because reacting too fast would only give her something to work with. I called in sick, canceled a standing meeting, and went to a small hotel near the office district where no one would think to look for me. I slept for 3 hours and woke up clear-headed. That was when I started doing the things I should have done months earlier. I reviewed account statements, cross-checked balances, and confirmed what was in my name and what was not. The picture that formed was uncomfortable but not surprising. Most of the shared planning had been verbal. Most of the commitments were assumed. The deposits were split, but the paper trail was uneven. That unevenness would matter. Vanessa finally called around noon. Her voice was controlled, almost calm, the way it gets when she has already decided what the conversation is supposed to accomplish. She asked me to come back to the apartment so we could talk like adults. I said we could meet somewhere public. She pushed back, said there was no need to involve outsiders. I repeated myself. She agreed. We met at a cafe 2 blocks from the apartment. Neutral territory, crowded enough to discourage theatrics. She arrived early, already seated, her posture composed, her phone face down on the table as if she had nothing left to check. She looked tired, but not shaken. That distinction mattered. She did not start with apologies. She started with context. She talked about how long things had felt uncertain, how my work had pulled me away, how she had felt sidelined in decisions that affected her future. She framed the affair as a symptom, not a choice. I let her talk. Interrupting would only slow her down. When she finished, she leaned forward slightly and asked about the check again. Not whether I was okay. Not whether I planned to leave permanently. She asked whether the funds were liquid and whether I had already spoken to anyone about allocating them. The question landed exactly where I expected it to. I told her the money was already mine to allocate. Her eyes flickered. She adjusted quickly, shifting to a different angle. She reminded me that we were engaged, that decisions had been made in anticipation of shared income. She said that walking away now would leave her exposed. She said exposure was not fair. I said fairness had already left the room. The conversation changed shape after that. She stopped trying to explain what had happened and started outlining what she believed should happen next. She talked about postponing any final decisions until emotions settled. She suggested we speak to a mediator, someone neutral who could help us untangle finances without escalating things. She emphasized discretion. She used the word quiet more than once. I noticed then how carefully she avoided mentioning the man from the night before. He had already been erased from the narrative. A variable removed once it stopped being useful. I told her I would not be delaying anything. I told her I would be speaking to a lawyer. That was when the temperature shifted. Her voice tightened, and the composure she had maintained began to crack around the edges. She warned me not to make this bigger than it needed to be. She reminded me of my reputation at work, of how quickly rumors travel, of how easy it is for stories to be misinterpreted when emotions run high. I finished my coffee and stood up. I told her I would be in touch through proper channels. She stayed seated, watching me leave, already recalculating. That afternoon, I called Harold Keene. We had known each other since before either of us had real money to worry about. He listened without interrupting, asked a few precise questions, and confirmed what I already suspected. There was no common law claim. There was no automatic entitlement. The check was clean. The timing was unfortunate, but not dangerous. What was dangerous was waiting. I returned to the apartment the next day with Harold's advice in mind. I did not go alone. I brought a friend from the office, someone neutral enough to serve as a witness without being emotionally invested. Vanessa was there, sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of her like a proposal deck. She looked up when we entered, surprised but not unprepared. She had been busy. She had printed vendor agreements, bank summaries, timelines. She had highlighted sections she believed supported her position. She spoke confidently, walking us through her interpretation of what we had built together. She framed the relationship as a joint venture that had reached an inflection point. She argued that walking away with everything would be unjust. I listened, flipping through the papers, noting what was missing as much as what was included. There were assumptions everywhere. There were very few signatures. When she finished, she asked what I intended to do. I told her I intended to leave with my belongings and my money. I told her the wedding was canceled. I told her any further discussion would happen through lawyers. She laughed then, not because it was funny, but because disbelief had finally overtaken control. She said I was overestimating my position. She said people do not walk away from shared futures without consequences. She said she had already spoken to someone who disagreed with my interpretation. That was new. I asked who. She hesitated, then said it did not matter. What mattered was that she was not going to be left empty-handed because of a technicality. She accused me of hiding behind paperwork. She accused me of planning my exit long before she did. I did not argue. I packed my things methodically, taking what was mine and leaving what was not. She followed me from room to room, continuing to talk, adjusting tactics in real time. She alternated between appeals and accusations, between reminders of what we had planned and warnings about what she could do if pushed. The most revealing moment came when she finally said what she had been circling since the cafe. She admitted she did not think the deal would close. She admitted she had assumed the pressure would break me or stall the outcome. She admitted the other man was never meant to replace me permanently. He was insurance. Insurance against failure. The words settled heavily in the air. There was no anger in them, just calculation. She had hedged her bets and lost track of timing. The check had arrived at the worst possible moment for her plan. I left the apartment with everything I needed and nothing I did not. That evening, I sent a single message outlining boundaries and next steps. No accusations. No explanations. Just facts. Vanessa responded with a longer message that tried to reopen the conversation. I did not reply. Instead, I forwarded it to Harold and began preparing for what came next. Because it was clear now that she was not going to let this end quietly. And it was equally clear that she believed escalation favored her. She was wrong. The moment I stopped responding directly, Vanessa changed tactics. At first, it was subtle. Emails instead of texts. Carefully structured paragraphs instead of emotional spillover. The tone shifted from conversational to formal, as if she were rehearsing for an audience she expected to appear later. She framed everything as a misunderstanding that could still be resolved with cooperation. She emphasized how much damage prolonged conflict could cause to both of us, especially with the deal so recent and my position at work still visible. I did not respond. 2 days later, the messages stopped altogether. That silence lasted long enough to feel intentional. I knew what it meant. When someone who needs leverage goes quiet, it is rarely because they have given up. It is because they are assembling something. Harold confirmed it when he called me early that morning. Vanessa had reached out to a legal office downtown, one known for aggressive negotiation rather than litigation. They had not filed anything, but they had asked questions. Specific questions. About timelines. About shared residency. About public exposure. That was when the situation crossed a line. I spent that afternoon documenting everything. Dates, transfers, messages, travel records. I did not embellish. I did not editorialize. I wrote things down exactly as they had occurred. When patterns appeared, I noted them. When assumptions failed, I crossed them out. The process was tedious, but it gave structure to something that had previously relied on momentum. Vanessa broke the silence that evening with a message that read like a summary rather than a plea. She proposed a settlement. She did not call it that, but the language was unmistakable. She suggested a fixed payout in exchange for closure. No accusations. No public fallout. No complications. It was the first time she acknowledged the end as permanent. The amount she referenced was not arbitrary. It was calculated to feel smaller than the check, while still large enough to sting. She framed it as a bridge to independence, a way for both of us to move forward without dragging the past into future rooms. She suggested a deadline. I forwarded the message to Harold and waited. The next step came faster than expected. Vanessa's sister, Elaine, called the following morning. We had always been polite with each other, careful not to overstep. She did not start the conversation with confrontation. She asked how I was holding up. She asked whether I was eating properly. She asked whether the stress had been manageable. Then she pivoted. She talked about family dynamics, about how breakups ripple outward, about how no one really wins when things escalate. She mentioned that Vanessa was struggling, that the situation was not as simple as it appeared. She suggested a conversation between the three of us to smooth things over. I declined. Elaine's tone changed immediately. The warmth drained out of it, replaced by something firmer. She warned me that people were already talking, that narratives form whether or not you participate. She suggested that controlling the narrative early could prevent unnecessary damage. She implied that my silence was being interpreted as arrogance. I told her to direct any further communication through legal counsel. She hung up without saying goodbye. By the end of the week, the threat was no longer implied. Vanessa sent a final message outlining what she would do if I refused to cooperate. She referenced conversations she claimed to have had with people at my firm. She suggested that questions could be raised about my conduct, about my availability, about whether my priorities had compromised my judgment during the deal. It was extortion, stripped of its dramatic packaging. Harold advised me not to respond directly. He drafted a notice instead, outlining boundaries and consequences. It was factual, restrained, and precise. It acknowledged receipt of her proposal, rejected it, and warned against further attempts to coerce or misrepresent. It stated clearly that any escalation would be met with documentation. Vanessa responded within minutes. The composure she had maintained finally cracked. The message was longer, less structured, full of contradictions she did not bother to reconcile. She accused me of betrayal, of rewriting history, of weaponizing success against her. She claimed she had supported me through the worst periods of my career and deserved compensation for that investment. She also made a mistake. In her urgency, she referenced details that only someone planning ahead would know. Vendor refund timelines. Account balances she no longer had access to. Conversations she claimed were private but had occurred in writing. The message revealed more than it concealed. Harold flagged it immediately. The leverage Vanessa believed she held was built on assumptions, not evidence. The threats she made were empty, without proof. The risk she posed was reputational, not legal. That did not make it harmless. I took a week off work. Not because I needed rest, but because I needed control. I briefed my supervisor on the situation without dramatizing it. I provided context, not accusations. I told him there might be noise. He appreciated the transparency. He confirmed that my performance spoke louder than speculation. Vanessa tried one last time to reframe the situation as mutual failure. She suggested arbitration. She suggested splitting the difference. She suggested revisiting the timeline with a neutral third party. I said no. The turning point came when Brandon reached out. I had not heard from him since the night he left the apartment half-dressed and embarrassed. His message was short and awkward. He said he felt he should clarify his involvement. He said he had not known about the engagement initially. He said Vanessa had told him we were effectively over. He said the situation had escalated beyond what he signed up for. I did not respond immediately. I forwarded the message to Harold. Brandon followed up with a longer explanation. He detailed the timeline as he understood it, including dates that overlapped inconveniently with Vanessa's claims. He mentioned conversations where she expressed doubt about my deal closing. He described being positioned as a temporary solution, not a partner. He did not realize he was corroborating everything. Harold advised me to preserve the messages, not to engage, not to correct, just to let Brandon talk. When people feel misled, they often provide clarity without being asked. Vanessa did not know about this development. She continued to push her narrative, unaware that one of her variables had detached itself and was drifting out of alignment. Her next message doubled down on consequences, referencing specific individuals she claimed to have spoken with. Harold responded formally this time. He outlined the evidence we had. He referenced corroboration. He warned against defamation. He stated clearly that any attempt to interfere with my employment would be documented and pursued. The reply came hours later. It was shorter than the others. No accusations. No threats. Just a request for time. A pause. A reconsideration. By then, the dynamic had shifted. The apartment was no longer contested territory. The wedding was no longer a looming obligation. The money was no longer theoretical. The only thing left was Vanessa's insistence on salvaging leverage that no longer existed. I spent the weekend finalizing arrangements. I changed addresses. I closed shared accounts. I documented everything one last time and filed it away. Not because I expected to use it, but because I refused to be unprepared. Vanessa sent one final message on Sunday night. She asked whether we could meet one last time to talk things through privately. She said she needed closure. I did not respond, because closure had already happened. It just had not arrived on her schedule, and I knew that whatever came next would not be negotiation. It would be consequence. The check cleared on a Tuesday morning. There was no fanfare attached to it. No alert worth celebrating. Just a confirmation in my account that a number had become real and irreversible. $250,000 stopped being a promise and started being a boundary. I sat at my desk and watched the transaction settle, not because I enjoyed it, but because I needed to know the exact moment when the last practical excuse for interference disappeared. Vanessa did not know yet. I had stopped sharing information weeks earlier. Silence had done more work than argument ever could. That afternoon, Harold filed the final notices. The engagement deposits were formally canceled. The shared utilities were separated. The last joint account was closed. Everything was documented, time-stamped, and confirmed. The process was unglamorous and methodical, which was exactly what it needed to be. Drama thrives on gaps. Paperwork does not. Vanessa learned about the deposits first. A vendor contacted her to confirm the cancellation and refund distribution. The refund did not go to her. It went back to the account that paid it. The call set off a chain reaction. She sent a message that night. Not long, not emotional. She asked whether I planned to discuss the refunds. She asked whether I thought it was fair to decide everything unilaterally. I forwarded it to Harold and did not respond. The next message arrived the following morning, longer and more urgent. She wrote about trust, about shared expectations, about how final decisions should involve conversation. She suggested that I was deliberately humiliating her. She said mutual acquaintances were asking questions. That part was true. People had noticed the wedding cancellation. They had noticed my absence. They had noticed her sudden attempts to explain things that no one had asked about. Stories were circulating, incomplete and inconsistent. Vanessa tried to get ahead of them. The problem was that she kept changing the lead. By midweek, the tone shifted again. She asked whether there was any chance of revisiting a settlement. She framed it as closure, as a way to put the situation behind us. She referenced stress, health, the toll of uncertainty. She did not mention threats. She did not mention leverage. Harold advised me to send a single response. It was brief and factual. It stated that there would be no settlement. It stated that further contact should cease. It stated that any continued attempts to pressure or misrepresent would be addressed formally. That was the last message she received from my side. The consequences unfolded without coordination. Brandon stopped responding to her calls. He had already distanced himself publicly, telling people he had been misled about the engagement and the timeline. He did not volunteer details, but he did not protect her either. When asked directly, he corrected inaccuracies. That was enough. Elaine tried one final time to intervene. She left a voicemail asking me to reconsider, to think about the long-term impact of hard lines. She warned me that cutting things off completely could create resentment that never fades. I did not return the call. By Friday, Vanessa's approach shifted from pressure to damage control. She contacted vendors, friends, and relatives, trying to stabilize her version of events. The problem was consistency. Every explanation contradicted the last. The more she tried to manage perception, the more obvious the manipulation became. At work, nothing happened. No questions were raised. No rumors gained traction. My supervisor asked once whether everything was settled. I said yes. He nodded and moved on. Performance does not leave much room for fiction. The money began doing what money does when it is not tied to obligation. It created options. I paid off the remaining balance on my car. I moved into a smaller place closer to the office, temporary by design. I allocated a portion of the funds into a venture I had been delaying for years, not because it was risky, but because it required focus I had not previously had. Vanessa noticed the move through mutual acquaintances. She did not know the address. She did not know the terms. She knew only that the life she had assumed would continue alongside hers had detached completely. The last attempt came 2 weeks later. She sent an email, not a message. It was written carefully, as if reviewed by someone else. She acknowledged mistakes without naming them. She expressed regret without specifying cause. She asked for a meeting to reach emotional closure. I did not respond. Closure is not a conversation. It is the absence of one. The final consequence arrived quietly. A vendor dispute Vanessa had initiated collapsed when documentation was requested. A refund she expected never arrived. A lease she assumed would be renewed without issue was not. She began selling items online, not out of desperation, but adjustment. The lifestyle she had planned for required support that no longer existed. I did not monitor her situation. Information reached me through the same channels that had once carried assumptions. Friends mentioned changes without commentary. Someone asked whether I felt vindicated. I did not. Vindication implies an audience. I had already left the room. The strangest part was how quickly normalcy returned. Not the old normal, but a quieter one. Days filled with work that did not feel like escape. Evenings that did not require explanation. Decisions that did not need consensus. One evening, months later, I found the jacket I had worn the night I came home with the check. It still smelled faintly of the cologne that had first alerted me something was wrong. I took the check stub from the inner pocket and folded it once more before throwing it away. The money had done its work. Not because it was large, but because it had arrived at exactly the wrong time for someone who believed control was permanent. Vanessa demanded certainty after she had already undermined it. She demanded compensation after she had gambled with leverage she did not actually possess. She demanded negotiation when the only remaining option was acceptance. I did not rebuild out of spite. I rebuilt out of accuracy. And the life I started that night did not require permission from someone who had already chosen another version of events.